As myself and Gillian have figured out just now that Gillian will sit there and I'll do the slideshow passing on for, since I've done such a good job for John, just about. Gillian was a student and now she's a civil servant, but about 2 years ago, while during her student days doing a master's, she did some research, having some conversations with some of her colleagues in public service, so within the houses of the Oireachtas, TDs and I believe also senators. And some of that research work and the results of that will perhaps, going on one of John's point, help us to have a clearer picture and a clearer understanding of what are the kinds of corruption that are taking place, or perceptions of corruption that are acceptable or unacceptable here in Ireland at the moment. So I'll hand over to Gillian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
As Ireland struggled through the economic devastation of the 1980s, the close connection that existed between the nation's wealthiest businessmen and top politicians and bureaucrats was largely ignored. However, towards the end of the decade, corruption became more of a political issue. And in the 90s, the Beef Tribunal saw the clear links between business and politics exposed. More importantly, it clearly outlined the effect that these close links had on both policy and administrative practices. The level and nature of the links between business and politics was further exposed by the tribunals which followed: the McCracken, the Moriarty, which is still ongoing, and the Flood-Mahan, which is still ongoing. These exposed complicated networks of secret payments to politicians and public officials. In the course of these tribunals, many politicians used the defence that they broke no law. As John was saying, they actually weren't doing anything illegal. Whether they were accepting money in a paper bag in Swords, or in a whip around in Manchester, or in loans written off by the AIB, none of the former ministers or Taoiseach were actually breaking any laws. However, it was clear to the general public and to Justice McCracken that it was unlikely that businessmen would make such large donations for nothing in return. In the absence of clearly defined ethical guidelines, it seems that politicians were blurring the line between their public and private lives, and in this way they may have been using their public office for private gain, which is really the essence of corruption. The Rainbow Coalition began the effort to improve ethical standards among Irish politicians by introducing the Ethics Acts in '95. They were supported by the Electoral Act in '97 and the Freedom of Information Act in '97. It was hoped that legislating against corruption would deter politicians from engaging in unethical behaviour. As the first decade of the 21st century draws to a close, Irish politics is still dominated by corruption scandals. Bertie Ahern was forced to resign as Taoiseach as the Mahon Tribunal tightened its grip on him, and questions are being asked about the relationship between the banks, the financial regulator and the Department of Finance. As the ethics regime has been in place for over 10 years, it is timely to research what effect, if any, the laws have had on members' attitudes to corrupt activity. As corruption is by its nature secretive and difficult to measure, it is useful to assess it by analysing perceptions of corruption and attitudes of elites in order to determine their tolerance to corrupt practices. These studies, the method of measuring elite perceptions of corruption emerged in the USA in the post-Watergate era, where obviously corruption was high on their agenda there. These studies utilised questionnaires which posed a variety of scenarios to legislators and then asked whether they thought they were corrupt or not. By analysing the results, it is possible to measure at least the least corrupt that a politician will be. The studies in the US were further developed by researchers in Canada, Australia and the UK. My research examined the attitudes of Oireachtas members to corruption by gathering data through surveys. Through an examination of members' attitudes, it's possible to assess whether an elite political culture exists in the Oireachtas. If such a culture exists, it would be indicated by a consensus of opinion towards among Oireachtas members regarding corrupt activities. If the elite culture exhibits intolerance towards corrupt activities, this indicates that the ethics legislation has been effective. The responses are also compared to data from other surveys in order to assess Oireachtas members' relative tolerance to corruption. This is the actual questionnaire that I issued to Oireachtas members in 2007-2008. It was right around the time Taoiseach Ahern was at the tribunal. And I got a fairly good response rate. I got 68 responses filled out, which is about a 30% response rate. I did get some letters telling me that they wouldn't respond also. No similar study has ever been done in the Oireachtas, so it's not possible to compare changes over time. However, there has been similar studies done in the UK, both prior to they had reforms in the UK in the 90s also. So the two studies have been done in the UK. The main finding of this research is that you can see that the responses are all here. The main finding is that there's not an elite culture within the Oireachtas, because you can see there's a divergence there between the corrupt and the not corrupt. There's no, they don't really agree on what's corrupt and what's not corrupt. There was 2 control questions at the top. They're ranked in order of corruption there. The Garda was found corrupt. We're glad to see it was where a Garda accepts a bribe of €50 by 91% of our Oireachtas members believe that that's corrupt, or at least the ones that responded. Unfortunately, 4% think it's not corrupt, and that would mean that, another 5% don't know. And then at the end, the meeting at the second one from the bottom described where a businessman would go in to meet with the Department of Finance, which is actually not corrupt. It's quite good that the members of the business community would meet with members of the Department of Finance to discuss possible legislation or things they might need. And unfortunately, 7% of Oireachtas members found this corrupt, which may indicate a certain level of sensitivity in those that responded to the survey. The general results were that women were more intolerant of corruption than men. There is unfortunately a small number of women in the Oireachtas, so it was a small sample, but it does concur with international studies the same. So if we get more women into politics, we might have less corruption. Also, those serving longer than 10 years were the most intolerant of corruption, or therefore the most ethical, and those serving between 5 and 10 years were the most tolerant. This disagrees with other international studies which show that the longer a person is in office, that the more accepting they will be that the unethical behaviour is really part of the institution. I also found that Dáil members were more intolerant of corruption or more ethical than senators. The results were examined under 2 areas, conflict of interest and constituency service situations. Constituency service is where obviously a legislator is doing something for his constituents or providing something that will be a gain to his constituents. There is opportunity here for the legitimate and illegitimate activity to kind of become blurred. Conflict of interest is a situation that arises when an individual's legislative autonomy is compromised by personal concerns. This can be eliminated by recusal from the decision-making process or by divesting the concern. In Ireland, the preferred method is transparency through the FOI and through a register of members' interests. I'm just going to look there. These are the different questions that fall into the categories that we're going to examine. I'm just going to look at 2. This shows the responses to the contract question, where a cabinet minister uses his influence to obtain a large contract for a firm in his constituency. And as we can see here, more people in Ireland, the dark blue would be the Oireachtas, found it corrupt than the pre-reform UK respondents, but far less people than the post-reform UK respondents. And the reasons for this may be because in Ireland, it's seen, you get political currency when you provide something to your constituency, and because of PRS-TV, it's very important that the results in elections are very marginal, and it's important that politicians maintain that contact with their constituents and that political currency. It's also been shown by research in voters in Ireland that the currency gained from such things is more important to voters than political marketing or advertising, and it has more of an effect. This shows the response to the hospital question, which is where the TDs actually, I had put friend or relative, but the TDs actually and senators, most of them crossed it out and wrote constituents, so I took it as a constituency service type scenario. And this shows the huge difference between the responses of the TDs, which just over 20% found it corrupt, versus almost 90% of a similar type scenario in the post-reform UK study. And this again is due to the closeness of, I assume is due to the closeness of TDs to their constituents, versus in England where they have much larger constituencies. This is the position scenario where a cabinet minister promises an appointed position in exchange for campaign contributions to the party. The differences are not as blatant as for the previous ones, but there still is some difference there. These could be explained by the different political culture and structures that exist between Ireland and the UK. In the UK, the first study was done in the 1980s and the second one in the 90s. And in the 1980s, the Labour Party in the UK had no expectation of getting into of getting into government, and the Liberals had no expectation of entering coalition, whereas in Ireland, coalition has become the norm, and all parties at some point have an expectation that they will share in the spoils of office. So it may be just more acceptable to them that they eventually, when they are in government, they also want to have those spoils. Appointments to state boards are considered a reward to party members and donors. Before the former Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, before he departed, there was reported 10 times the number of appointments to state boards were made than in the whole previous period of his government. Sorry. He also appointed his former life partner to the board of the National Consumer Agency. So this practice is generally accepted by political parties, and although it has been the government have been derided by Fine Gael for doing this. They didn't actually do anything to change it when they were in power. You can assume that they possibly want to have this when they're back in power themselves. It has been criticised by independents. One independent senator who I interviewed said that you can pick out the number of political appointees on state boards, and there's very few people that are there on merit. Ironically, this may have contributed, as John said, to the property bubble due to the lack of regulation, because people were all kind of helping their friends. It's crony capitalism. Sorry, I just thought I'd put that in. It's a gift of a bottle of wine, and Irish politicians, actually it was a case of wine. There's a huge difference, which maybe because of the close links between TDs and their constituents, or maybe because of Irish association with alcohol and conviviality. But I have to say that a lot of TDs and senators wrote on the returns of the surveys that they often receive a bottle of wine, but they'd love to receive a case.